The sound of engines thundered overhead as Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Morrison crouched in the belly of the C-47 transport, his weathered hands gripping a folded map that command had ordered him to destroy. It was June 5, 1944, 11 hours before the largest amphibious invasion in human history would begin, and Morrison knew something that could save hundreds of lives or cost him his career. The paper in his hands contained reconnaissance photographs and German troop positions that directly contradicted the official intelligence briefings. Every paratrooper aboard the 73 aircraft of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was flying toward drop zones that German forces had turned into carefully orchestrated killing fields. Morrison looked around at the young faces surrounding him, most of them barely old enough to vote, all of them trusting that their commanders had chosen safe landing sites. He closed his eyes and made a decision that would violate every chain of command protocol he had ever learned. No one in the 82nd Airborne Division knew that one man's defiance that night would rewrite the survival odds for Operation Overlord. James Morrison had grown up in the wheat fields of Kansas, the son of a Methodist minister and a school teacher who had instilled in him an unwavering sense of right and wrong. Born in 1921 in the small town of Abilene, Morrison was the middle child of 5, distinguished mainly by his ability to notice details that others missed and his stubborn refusal to accept answers that didn't make sense. His father, Reverend William Morrison, often told parishioners that Jimmy could spot a lie from 50 yards away, a trait that occasionally got the boy into trouble but would prove invaluable during wartime. After graduating valedictorian from Abilene High School in 1939, Morrison had planned to study engineering at Kansas State University, but the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. On December 8, 1941, one day after the Japanese assault, Morrison walked into the Army recruitment office in Salina and enlisted as a private, determined to use his analytical mind in service of his country. Military training revealed Morrison's exceptional talent for interpreting aerial reconnaissance photographs and terrain maps. His instructors at Fort Benning noticed that he could identify camouflaged positions, supply routes, and defensive preparations with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. By 1942, Morrison had been selected for advanced intelligence training and commissioned as a second lieutenant. He spent months studying German military tactics, learning to read the landscape like a book, understanding how terrain shaped battlefield advantages. His fellow officers initially viewed him with suspicion. A farm boy from Kansas seemed an unlikely expert on European warfare, but Morrison's predictions about German defensive positions proved accurate time after time during training exercises. When the 82nd Airborne Division was assigned to Operation Overlord, Morrison was handpicked to serve as reconnaissance liaison, responsible for analyzing drop zone intelligence and briefing paratrooper commanders. He had no idea that those analytical skills would soon reveal a truth so disturbing that following orders might mean sending hundreds of young soldiers to their deaths. The invasion of Normandy represented the culmination of 3 years of Allied planning, the largest military operation in history, designed to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. By June of 1944, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months fortifying the Atlantic Wall, a series of coastal defenses stretching from Norway to Spain. The German strategy was simple: make the cost of invasion so catastrophic that Allied forces would be thrown back into the sea before they could establish a beachhead. Rommel understood that paratroopers would be dropped inland to secure bridges, crossroads, and communication centers before the amphibious assault began. German intelligence had identified likely drop zones and had spent weeks positioning troops, anti-aircraft guns, and obstacles specifically designed to slaughter airborne forces during their most vulnerable moments. The mathematics were terrifying. Paratroopers would be scattered across unfamiliar terrain, armed only with light weapons, facing entrenched German forces who knew exactly where they were landing. Supreme Allied Command had developed detailed plans for airborne operations, designating specific drop zones based on aerial reconnaissance conducted during the spring of 1944. The official intelligence assessment concluded that German defenses around the planned drop zones were minimal, consisting primarily of scattered infantry units and light anti-aircraft positions. Allied commanders believed that paratroopers would face manageable resistance and could accomplish their objectives before German reinforcements arrived. However, what Allied intelligence did not know was that Rommel had ordered a massive redeployment of forces during the final weeks of May, moving elite troops and heavy weapons into positions that would turn the designated drop zones into perfectly designed ambushes. The German commander had studied Allied paratrooper tactics extensively and understood that airborne forces would be most vulnerable during the first hour after landing, when soldiers were scattered, disoriented, and attempting to locate their equipment. He positioned machine gun nests, mortar teams, and sniper positions to create overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any force attempting to organize after landing. Morrison first noticed the discrepancies on June 2nd while reviewing reconnaissance photographs taken by Royal Air Force Spitfire fighters during low-level flights over the Normandy Peninsula. The official intelligence summary described light German presence in Drop Zone A, the primary landing area for the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. But Morrison's trained eye spotted details that the summary had missed: fresh earth around camouflaged positions, tire tracks indicating recent heavy vehicle movement, and geometric patterns in vegetation that suggested carefully constructed defensive positions. He requested additional photographs from different angles and times of day, using techniques he had learned for identifying camouflaged installations. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The photographs revealed that German forces had transformed Drop Zone A into a carefully orchestrated killing field. Morrison identified at least 12 machine gun positions positioned to create crossfire patterns across the entire landing area. Anti-aircraft guns had been moved into positions where they could be quickly repositioned to fire directly at paratroopers on the ground. Most disturbing of all, Morrison spotted evidence of Rommelspargel, wooden stakes topped with mines and wire, that would impale gliders and tangle parachute lines. The German defenses were positioned with mathematical precision, designed to channel surviving paratroopers into predetermined zones where pre-registered mortars could destroy them with devastating efficiency. Morrison calculated that at least 60% of the 502nd Regiment would be killed or wounded within the first 10 minutes of landing. When Morrison presented his analysis to Colonel James Gavin, the regimental commander listened carefully but ultimately dismissed the intelligence. The mission parameters had been established at the highest levels of Allied command, and changing drop zones at this late stage would disrupt the entire invasion timeline. Gavin explained that alternative landing areas had not been adequately reconnoitered, and that diverting paratroopers to unknown terrain might prove even more dangerous than the identified risks. Furthermore, the broader success of Operation Overlord depended on paratroopers securing specific objectives at precise times. Morrison was ordered to file his report through proper channels, but to continue briefing paratroopers based on the official intelligence assessment. As Morrison saluted and left the colonel's tent, he understood that bureaucratic momentum was about to send nearly 3,000 young soldiers into a meticulously planned massacre. That evening, Morrison sat alone in his quarters, staring at the reconnaissance photographs spread across his field desk. The faces of paratroopers he had briefed earlier that day flashed through his memory. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston, who carried pictures of his newborn daughter in his helmet liner, Private First Class David Chen from San Francisco, who had enlisted after his family was sent to an internment camp. Corporal Thomas Williams from Detroit, who had survived the Sicily campaign and was scheduled to return home after Normandy. Morrison knew their names, their stories, their hopes for survival and return. He also knew that following orders meant watching them die in a carefully prepared trap. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. He had sworn an oath to obey the orders of his superior officers, but he had also sworn to protect the soldiers under his command. Those two oaths were about to collide in a way that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and moral courage. Morrison spent the next hour developing an unauthorized plan. If he could not change the official drop zones, he could at least provide individual paratroopers with information that might help them survive the initial ambush. Using his detailed analysis of German defensive positions, Morrison created hand-drawn maps showing safe approach routes, identified cover positions, and marked areas where German forces were likely to concentrate their fire. He plotted alternative assembly points where scattered paratroopers could regroup without walking into prepared killing zones. Most importantly, Morrison identified a series of abandoned farm buildings and drainage ditches that could provide temporary shelter during the critical first hour after landing. The maps violated security protocols, contained classified information, and directly contradicted official briefings, but they represented the difference between survival and annihilation for soldiers who trusted their commanders to give them accurate intelligence. At 2300 hours on June 5th, Morrison made his choice. Instead of returning to his quarters for the final night before the invasion, he walked through the airfield where paratroopers were conducting last-minute equipment checks and writing letters home. Morrison approached small groups of soldiers claiming to provide supplemental briefing information based on updated reconnaissance data. He handed out his unauthorized maps and quietly explained the actual nature of German defenses around the drop zones. Morrison told paratroopers to avoid the center of the landing area, to move immediately toward the eastern edge of the zone where German positions were thinner, and to establish temporary defensive positions rather than attempting to advance toward their primary objectives. He emphasized that the first hour would determine their survival and that official assembly procedures had been compromised by German intelligence. Sergeant O'Brien studied Morrison's map carefully, comparing it to the official briefing materials he had received earlier that day. The discrepancies were obvious and disturbing. According to Morrison's intelligence, the planned assembly point was positioned directly between two German machine gun nests, making it a perfect killing field for any paratroopers attempting to organize after landing. O'Brien asked Morrison why this information had not been included in the official briefings, and Morrison explained that command had decided the risks were acceptable, given the strategic importance of the mission objectives. O'Brien folded Morrison's map carefully and tucked it inside his field jacket. He looked Morrison directly in the eyes and said, "Lieutenant, if you're right about this, you just saved my life. If you're wrong, I'll see you in a court-martial." Morrison nodded and moved on to the next group of soldiers. By midnight, Morrison had distributed nearly 50 unauthorized maps and briefed almost 200 paratroopers on the actual nature of German defenses. Word spread quickly through the ranks, with experienced non-commissioned officers sharing Morrison's intelligence with soldiers in their squads. The information created a ripple effect throughout the 502nd Regiment as paratroopers began modifying their equipment loads, adjusting their landing procedures, and mentally preparing for a much more dangerous situation than they had been officially told to expect. Morrison knew that his actions would be discovered eventually, but he hoped that by the time his superiors realized what he had done, enough soldiers would have survived to justify his disobedience. As the C-47 transports prepared for takeoff in the early hours of June 6th, Morrison climbed aboard the lead aircraft carrying the regimental headquarters element. His official mission was to coordinate with ground forces once the drop zone had been secured and to provide ongoing intelligence support for paratrooper operations. His unofficial mission was to witness the results of his decision and to accept whatever consequences followed. As the aircraft engines roared to life and the formation began its flight across the English Channel, Morrison closed his eyes and prayed that he had chosen correctly. The flight across the Channel proceeded according to plan until the aircraft formation approached the Norman coast at approximately 0100 hours. German anti-aircraft fire erupted from dozens of positions, filling the sky with deadly flak that tore through aircraft fuselages and forced pilots to take evasive action. The carefully planned formation began to scatter as individual aircraft maneuvered to avoid destruction, disrupting the precise timing that was essential for coordinated airborne operations. Morrison's aircraft was hit twice by anti-aircraft fire, with one shell punching through the cargo compartment and another damaging the port engine. The pilot fought to maintain control as paratroopers prepared for a jump that would occur under far worse conditions than anyone had anticipated. When the green light flashed at 0130 hours, Morrison jumped into the darkness over Normandy alongside 36 paratroopers from regimental headquarters. The descent was chaotic, with heavy ground fire erupting from multiple directions and parachutes drifting far from the intended drop zone due to stronger than expected winds. Morrison landed hard in a flooded field nearly 2 miles from Drop Zone A, his parachute tangling in a fence post and his equipment scattered across muddy ground. As he struggled to free himself from his harness, the sound of machine gun fire echoed across the landscape, punctuated by explosions and the distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles. The battle for Normandy had begun, and Morrison's moment of truth was about to arrive. Morrison spent the first hour after landing moving cautiously toward Drop Zone A, using his detailed knowledge of German defensive positions to avoid contact while gathering information about the effectiveness of his unauthorized briefings. What he discovered exceeded his worst expectations and validated his most optimistic hopes. The German ambush had indeed been catastrophically effective, with machine gun positions and mortar teams destroying paratroopers who had followed official assembly procedures. Morrison counted at least 40 bodies in the central area of the drop zone, soldiers who had been cut down while attempting to reach the designated rally point. However, he also observed large numbers of paratroopers who had followed his alternative guidance, moving toward the eastern edge of the zone and establishing defensive positions in the cover locations he had identified. Sergeant O'Brien had survived the initial ambush by following Morrison's map exactly, leading his squad to an abandoned farmhouse that provided cover from German fire while offering good observation of enemy positions. From his concealed position, O'Brien watched as other paratroopers who had received Morrison's briefing successfully avoided the most dangerous areas of the drop zone and began organizing effective resistance to German forces. The unauthorized intelligence had clearly saved dozens of lives, but Morrison's disobedience was about to be discovered by his superior officers. Colonel Gavin landed approximately 1 mile south of Drop Zone A and immediately began attempting to establish command and control over his scattered regiment. When he reached the planned command post location, he found it under heavy German fire and largely abandoned except for casualties. As Gavin moved toward alternative positions, he encountered groups of paratroopers who were operating according to plans that differed significantly from his official orders. When questioned, several soldiers mentioned supplemental briefing information they had received from an intelligence lieutenant the previous evening. Gavin realized immediately that Morrison had violated direct orders and distributed unauthorized intelligence, but he also recognized that those actions had probably prevented a complete disaster. Throughout the morning of June 6th, Morrison's predictions about German defensive positions proved accurate with devastating precision. Official intelligence had completely failed to identify the true nature of enemy preparations. while Morrison's unauthorized reconnaissance had provided life-saving information about actual conditions on the ground. Paratroopers who had received his briefings suffered significantly lower casualty rates than those who had followed official procedures, with survival rates improving by an estimated 40% in the areas where Morrison's intelligence had been most widely distributed. The mathematical difference was stark. Approximately 120 paratroopers survived the initial contact because they had been warned about German positions and provided with alternative assembly procedures. By midday, Colonel Gavin had established effective command and control over most of his regiment, largely because enough soldiers had survived the initial German ambush to maintain unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The 502nd Regiment accomplished its primary mission objectives, securing key crossroads and preventing German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. However, Gavin knew that the success had come at the cost of one lieutenant's military career, as Morrison's violation of orders could not be ignored, despite its positive results. When Morrison reported to regimental headquarters that afternoon, Gavin confronted him directly about the unauthorized briefings. Morrison admitted his actions without hesitation, explaining that his analysis of reconnaissance photographs had revealed German defensive preparations that contradicted official intelligence assessments. He acknowledged violating orders, but stated that he believed his duty to protect soldiers superseded his obligation to follow procedures that he knew would result in unnecessary casualties. Gavin listened to Morrison's explanation while reviewing casualty reports that clearly demonstrated the effectiveness of the unauthorized intelligence. The colonel faced his own impossible choice: court-martial an officer who had violated orders or ignore a breach of discipline that had saved American lives. Gavin's decision reflected the pragmatic realities of wartime leadership. Morrison received an official reprimand for violating security protocols and distributing unauthorized intelligence, but he was also quietly reassigned to a position where his analytical skills could be used more effectively. The reprimand remained in Morrison's personnel file, effectively ending any hope of promotion or advancement, but Gavin ensured that Morrison's actions were documented in after-action reports that praised the effectiveness of enhanced intelligence preparation in reducing casualties during airborne operations. The survivors of the 502nd Regiment never forgot the intelligence that had saved their lives. Sergeant O'Brien returned to Boston after the war and named his second son James in honor of the lieutenant who had given him the information that enabled his survival. Private First Class Chen wrote letters to Morrison for 20 years after the war, thanking him annually for the unauthorized briefing that had prevented his death in the Norman hedgerows. Corporal Williams became a police officer in Detroit and often told colleagues about the Army officer who had risked his career to save soldiers he barely knew. Morrison's violation of orders became a case study in military ethics courses, though his name was never officially associated with the incident. Staff colleges began teaching officers about the tension between obedience and moral responsibility, using the Normandy example to illustrate situations where following orders might conflict with the duty to protect subordinates. The unauthorized intelligence distribution demonstrated that effective leadership sometimes required accepting personal risk to ensure mission success and preserve human life. After the war, Morrison returned to Kansas and used his military intelligence experience to become a successful farmer and agricultural consultant. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and never spoke publicly about his actions during the D-Day invasion. Morrison's neighbors knew him as a quiet man who had served his country during the war, but they had no idea that his decision to disobey orders had saved the lives of more than 100 American soldiers. He carried the classified details of that night to his grave, dying in 1998 at the age of 77. Morrison's story represents the fundamental contradiction that exists at the heart of military service: the requirement to follow orders versus the obligation to protect those under your command. His decision to distribute unauthorized intelligence violated every protocol he had been taught, but it demonstrated a form of moral courage that transcended organizational loyalty. Morrison understood that saving lives was more important than preserving his career, and he accepted the personal consequences of that choice without complaint or regret. The true measure of Morrison's actions became clear in the decades that followed the Normandy invasion. The soldiers who survived because of his unauthorized briefings went on to live full lives, raising families, building careers, and contributing to their communities. Their children and grandchildren exist because one lieutenant chose to disobey orders that would have sent their fathers and grandfathers to their deaths. The mathematical calculation is simple. Morrison's career was sacrificed to preserve more than 100 lives, an exchange that he considered entirely worthwhile. The legacy of Morrison's decision extends beyond the immediate lives saved during the D-Day invasion. His actions demonstrated that effective leadership sometimes requires challenging authority when that authority is based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Morrison's willingness to risk court-martial to protect his soldiers established a standard of moral courage that influenced military leadership doctrine for generations. Modern officer training programs emphasize the importance of independent thinking and the responsibility to question orders that appear to be based on flawed intelligence or unrealistic assumptions. Morrison's story also illustrates the complex relationship between loyalty and conscience in military service. His decision to violate orders was not based on personal ambition or career advancement, but on a carefully reasoned analysis of available information and a commitment to protecting the soldiers under his command. Morrison demonstrated that true loyalty to the military mission sometimes requires disobeying specific orders when those orders conflict with larger objectives, such as preserving combat effectiveness and minimizing unnecessary casualties. The unauthorized intelligence that Morrison distributed saved lives by providing soldiers with accurate information about the conditions they would actually face, rather than the conditions their commanders hoped they would face. This distinction between optimistic planning assumptions and realistic battlefield assessment became a central theme in post-war military education, with Morrison's actions serving as an example of the importance of honest intelligence analysis, even when that analysis contradicted established plans. Today, 60 years after the D-Day invasion, Morrison's decision to disobey orders and distribute unauthorized intelligence stands as a testament to the power of individual moral courage in shaping historical outcomes. His actions remind us that sometimes the most important military victories are achieved not through blind obedience to authority, but through the willingness to challenge that authority when human lives hang in the balance. Morrison's story poses a question that remains relevant for every generation of military leaders. When does the duty to obey orders conflict with the duty to protect those who depend on your leadership? Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? The answer to that question defines not only individual character, but also the moral foundation upon which effective military leadership is built. Morrison chose conscience over career, lives over regulations, and moral courage over institutional loyalty. His decision illuminated a fundamental truth about leadership that transcends military service. Sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the rules, and the true measure of a leader is the willingness to accept personal consequences for protecting others. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when the stakes are measured in human lives rather than institutional approval.